Big Shaq was sipping his drink outside a grocery store when he heard it, a child's terrified cry. He turned his head and saw a cop twisting a 10-year-old boy's arms into cuffs. The kid sobbed, "I didn't do anything." The officer smirked. People watched. Phones recorded, but no one moved. Shaq set his bottle down, cracked his knuckles, and stepped forward. What he did next shook the city, ruined a corrupt cop's career, and sparked a movement no one saw coming. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Big Shaq leaned against his truck, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grocery store parking lot. He took a slow sip from his water bottle, scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone, when a sharp, panicked voice cut through the air. "No, please, I didn't do anything." Shaq's head snapped up. Across the lot near the store entrance, a scene was unfolding that made his stomach twist. A uniformed cop, stocky with a square jaw and buzz-cut hair, was gripping the arm of a young black boy. Couldn't have been older than 10. The kid's eyes were wide with terror, his little hands cuffed behind his back. The officer, whose name tag read Cole, wore a smug expression as he yanked the boy forward. "I told you to stop resisting," Cole said, tightening the cuffs until the boy whimpered. Shaq's jaw clenched. The kid wasn't resisting. He was frozen in fear. Around them, people watched, murmuring to each other, phones out, recording. Some shook their heads, some whispered angrily, but not one person stepped in. It was like they were waiting for someone else to do something. Shaq muttered under his breath, "Guess that someone is me." He tossed his water bottle into the truck bed and straightened up, his massive frame casting a long shadow as he started walking toward the officer. Each step was deliberate, heavy. Cole was too busy manhandling the kid to notice Shaq approaching. The boy Malik looked around desperately. "Please," he sniffled. I was waiting for my mom." Cole smirked. "Then maybe she should teach you not to loiter." Shaq's hands curled into fists. He stopped just a few feet away, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Let the kid go." Cole finally turned, his eyes moving up, way up, to meet Shaq's. The smirk faltered. "Move along, big guy. This doesn't concern you." Shaq didn't flinch, didn't blink. His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "I said, let the kid go." For the first time, the crowd stirred. People exchanged glances, whispers growing louder. Cole's grip on Malik's arm tightened. "Back off, or I'll charge you with obstruction." Shaq took a step closer, towering over him. "What's the charge?" Cole scoffed. "He looks suspicious." The crowd gasped. Someone cursed under their breath. Shaq exhaled slowly. His expression didn't change, but his eyes burned. "You arrested a child," he said, voice steady, "for looking suspicious?" Cole's smirk returned, but this time there was uncertainty behind it. "That's right." Shaq rolled his shoulders, cracking his knuckles. "Then you and me got a problem." The officer reached for his baton. Shaq didn't move. Officer Darren Cole barely turned his head as Shaq's massive frame loomed closer. He was too busy yanking Malik's small wrists, making the boy stumble forward. His smug grin barely wavered as he muttered, "Move along, big guy." "This doesn't concern you." Shaq didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He closed the distance between them, his presence alone making the crowd stir. Some onlookers lifted their phones higher, sensing that something big was about to happen. "Let the kid go." Shaq's voice was steady, deep and firm. Not a request, a command. Cole finally looked up, his jaw tightening as he took in just how large Shaq was. But instead of backing down, the officer's grip on Malik tightened. "You're interfering with an arrest," Cole snapped. "Step back, or I'll charge you with obstruction." Shaq's gaze flickered down to Malik, who was still sniffling, his little fingers trembling in the too tight cuffs. His lip quivered as he whispered, I was waiting for my mom." Shaq exhaled sharply through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. His fists twitched at his sides, but he didn't raise his voice. Didn't have to. "What's the charge?" Shaq asked, his words slow and deliberate. Cole scoffed, his smirk returning like he found this whole thing amusing. He glanced at the growing crowd, then back at Shaq. "He looks suspicious." The crowd gasped. A woman near the front muttered, "You gotta be kidding me." Shaq's jaw clenched, his shoulders squared. The tension in the air was thick, electric, the weight of it pressing against everyone watching. Malik sniffled. "Please." he whispered. I didn't do anything. Cole sneered. Maybe next time. Don't look like trouble. Shaq stepped even closer, his shadow completely engulfing the officer now. His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. You got proof? He asked. Cole stiffened. Any witness statements? Shaq continued. Security footage? Cole's lips parted, but no words came out. Or did you just see a black kid minding his business and decide that was enough? The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone cursed under their breath. A man near the back said, This ain't right. Cole's smirk faltered, but only for a second. Then he straightened his spine, puffing out his chest. I don't have to explain myself to you. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line. No, he agreed. You don't. Shaq took another step forward, eyes locked onto Cole's. But you will. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and Malik's shaky breaths, his small wrists twitching against the cold metal of the handcuffs. His face was streaked with silent tears, and his chest rose and fell rapidly, the panic evident in every movement. The bystanders stood frozen, phones in their hands, some recording, some just watching, waiting to see how this would unfold. Shaq took a slow step forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over the officer, his eyes sharp and unyielding, locked onto Cole's with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. When he spoke, his voice was deep, controlled, yet unmistakably firm. You arrested a child for looking suspicious? The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People exchanged glances and confusion turned to outrage. A few shifted uncomfortably while others whispered to each other, their expressions filled with disbelief. A man near the back scoffed. That's gotta be a joke. A woman gripping a grocery bag shook her head angrily. He's just a kid. What could he possibly have done? Officer Cole straightened his stance, his fingers digging into Malik's arm as if the boy was some kind of flight risk. He smirked, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He was loitering, he responded, his voice laced with authority, as if that explanation alone should have been enough. That was when a voice from the crowd cut through the rising murmurs. That's a lie. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, her face filled with fury. She pointed toward the entrance of the store. He was just waiting for his mom. I saw him standing there the whole time. He didn't touch anything, didn't talk to anyone, wasn't bothering a soul. The crowd reacted instantly. More voices joined in, echoing her statement. That's not right. Uncuff that boy. You gonna arrest every kid who waits for their parents now? Shaq remained still, his gaze never leaving the officer's face. His voice was quieter this time, but the authority in it was undeniable. Do you have proof? Cole's smirk faltered for the briefest second. Shaq took another deliberate step forward. A store report? Witness statements? Camera footage? Anything. He let the silence stretch, the question hanging heavily between them. Or are you just going off your gut feeling? Cole blinked, the confidence in his posture wavering. Shaq didn't stop. His voice dropped lower, colder. Because, from where I'm standing, the only one looking suspicious here is you. A sharp breath went through the crowd. A few people gasped. Others shook their heads, muttering under their breaths. A man in a baseball cap let out a dry chuckle. Well, damn, he's got a point. Cole's jaw twitched. His grip on Malik's arm tightened slightly, as if grounding himself. Step back, he ordered, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Shaq didn't move. The officer's hand shot out, pressing against Shaq's chest in an attempt to push him back. It was like trying to shove a brick wall. Shaq didn't budge. His body remained completely still, as if Cole's effort hadn't even registered. Cole's nostrils flared. The frustration in his expression deepened. I said walk away, he spat. Shaq exhaled slowly, his expression unchanging. His next words came deliberately, measured and unwavering. Make me. The crowd fell completely silent. The weight of the moment was almost unbearable. Cole's fingers hovered near his baton, his jaw tightening as if he was considering his next move. But before he could act, his radio crackled to life, cutting through the tension like a knife. The smirk on Officer Cole's face widened as he took a step closer to Shaq, his fingers grazing the handcuffs on his belt. His stance, puffed up with false confidence, screamed authority, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. All right, tough guy, Cole sneered, loud enough for the crowd to hear. You want to be a hero? Then you're under arrest too. Gas rippled through the onlookers. Someone in the back cursed under their breath. The tension had been thick before, but now it felt like a wire pulled so tight it was about to snap. Shaq, however, didn't even blink. Instead, he let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You want to arrest me?" His voice was almost amused, yet there was steel beneath the words. He took a slow step forward, towering over Cole like an immovable mountain. "Go ahead." For the first time, a sliver of hesitation crossed Cole's face. He knew exactly who Shaq was, and for a moment reality seemed to creep in. This wasn't just some random bystander stepping in. This was Big Shaq, a man with influence, respect, and a reputation that stretched far beyond this street corner. But his ego wouldn't let him back down. "You think I won't?" Cole barked, reaching for his cuffs. A woman's scream sliced through the moment. "Let my son go!" Heads snapped toward the sound. A woman, her face a mixture of fear and fury, was pushing her way through the crowd. Her wide, frantic eyes locked onto Malik, who still stood frozen, his small wrists bound by metal, his body trembling. "Mom!" Malik's voice cracked, and the sheer panic in it made more than a few onlookers grit their teeth. Shaq turned his head just slightly, watching the mother rush forward, her hands shaking. "That's my son. What the hell are you doing to him?" Cole shifted, his jaw tightening. He could feel control slipping through his fingers like sand, and he didn't like it. "He was... I don't care!" She cut him off, her voice shaking with rage. "He's a child! My child! You have no right..." Shaq saw it, the way Cole's fingers twitched, the way his chest rose sharply like a man drowning in his own arrogance. He was doubling down. "Ma'am, step back," Cole ordered, though his voice wasn't as strong as before. "Or I'll have to detain you, too." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. This wasn't just an unjust arrest anymore. This was spiraling into something even uglier. Shaq clenched his jaw, stepping between the officer and Malik's mother. "You really want to do this, officer?" His voice was dangerously low now, his patience hanging by a thread. "You're making the worst mistake of your career." Cole scoffed. "You think I care what you..." Then suddenly his radio crackled to life. "Cole, we need to talk. Now!" The voice on the other end was sharp, no nonsense, and filled with authority. Cole froze. His fingers hovered over his cuffs, his eyes darting toward the radio like it had betrayed him. Shaq crossed his arms, waiting. "Go on, officer. Sounds like your boss wants a word." The entire street seemed to hold its breath as Cole slowly reached for the radio. The way his fingers trembled didn't go unnoticed. Officer Cole's smirk faded the instant his radio crackled to life again. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't just another officer. It was someone with real authority. "Cole, report. Now." The voice was sharp, commanding, carrying a weight that made the tension in the air even thicker. It was the kind of voice that didn't ask questions. It demanded answers. Cole's fingers twitched over the radio. His usual arrogance faltered, but only for a split second. He wasn't just being contacted. He was being summoned. Around them, the crowd grew. More people had stopped to watch, their eyes bouncing between the officer and Shaq, waiting to see what would happen next. Some had their phones raised, recording, live streaming. The situation was quickly spiraling beyond Cole's control, and for the first time he seemed to realize it. With a sharp breath, he pressed the button on his radio, trying to steady his voice. "This is Officer Cole, handling a..." "I know what you're doing, Cole." The voice cut in before he could finish. It was deep, heavy with barely contained fury. "I'm watching the video right now. You want to tell me why the hell you're detaining a 10-year-old boy?" Cole's entire body went rigid. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were judging, whispering, growing louder. Shaq, standing with his arms crossed, took a step closer. His presence was unshaken, his towering frame making Cole look even smaller. "Better think real hard about your next move, officer," he said, his voice calm but firm, like a quiet storm rolling in before the thunder. Cole's jaw tightened. His pride wouldn't let him lose. Not like this. Not in front of all these people. Not in front of the cameras. He couldn't just back down. With a sudden, jerky movement, he yanked Malik forward, gripping the boy's small wrists tighter than necessary. "I'm taking him in," Cole snapped, his voice edged with frustration. "He's resisting." Malik stumbled, his body jerking forward from the force. His mother's scream cut through the noise as she tried to rush toward her son, but Shaq moved faster. Before anyone could react, Shaq's massive hand shot out and clamped around Cole's wrist. The officer froze mid-motion. The crowd gasped in collective shock. Shaq's grip was firm, unshakable, like iron locking into place. His voice when he spoke was low and steady, carrying a quiet power that sent a chill through the air. No, Shaq said, holding the officer's gaze. You're not. For the first time that night, the fearless Officer Cole looked afraid. Shaq's grip remained firm, his fingers locked around Officer Cole's wrist like a steel vise. The officer tried to jerk his hand away, but Shaq didn't let go. Not yet. His voice was steady, unwavering, carrying the weight of a man who had seen injustice too many times to ignore it now. You're done. Cole's face turned red, his pride bubbling into rage. His free hand shot down to his belt, fingers curling around the handle of his baton. The moment he yanked it free, gasps rippled through the crowd. People instinctively stepped back, some clutching their phones tighter, recording every second. Shaq didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Cole raised the baton slightly, but he hesitated. He wasn't an idiot. He knew who Shaq was, and right now the towering man in front of him wasn't backing down, not like the countless others Cole had intimidated before. Before the officer could decide what to do next, a sharp sound split through the night air. Wee-oh! Wee-oh! Sirens. Multiple. Bright red and blue lights bathed the parking lot in an eerie glow, flashing across the glass windows of the grocery store. The low hum of engines rumbled as two squad cars screeched to a stop just feet away. Doors swung open. More officers stepped out. Cole smirked, confidence creeping back into his face. Now you've done it, he spat, his voice smug. Backup's here. Shaq, still holding his ground, barely spared the incoming officers a glance. His eyes stayed locked onto Cole. One of the new officers, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a badge that gleamed under the streetlights, walked up with purpose. His eyes flicked between Shaq and Cole, taking in the scene, the tense faces of the crowd, the sheer silence hanging over everything. But instead of addressing Cole, the officer turned to Shaq. Sir, we need you to come with us. For the first time in this whole confrontation, Shaq raised an eyebrow. He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Me? Cole let out a dry, triumphant chuckle. Damn right, he sneered. Obstruction of justice, interfering with an arrest, assaulting an officer. But before he could finish, the older officer's voice cut through the tension. That's enough, Cole. Cole blinked. Sir? The officer shook his head, then turned back to Shaq, his voice firm but devoid of hostility. The chief wants to see you. Now. The weight in those words sent a ripple through the crowd. Whispers spread, the tension shifting into something more unpredictable. Shaq exhaled slowly, then finally let go of Cole's wrist. The officer stumbled back slightly, rubbing the red mark left behind. Shaq rolled his shoulders, glanced down at Malik, who was still shaking, his wide eyes darting between the adults, and then finally met the gaze of the officer who had spoken. He nodded once. All right. As Shaq followed the officer toward the squad car, he could still feel the heated glare of Officer Cole burning into his back. But what Cole didn't realize was that Shaq wasn't being arrested. He was about to change everything. The police station was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that carried weight, like something big was about to unfold. Shaq stepped inside, his heavy footsteps echoing against the linoleum floor. Officers moved around him, some stealing cautious glances, others deliberately avoiding eye contact. He could feel the tension thick in the air, the kind that only came when an institution knew it was under scrutiny. The officer who had escorted him didn't say a word as they passed the front desk, moving past rows of cubicles where uniformed cops typed reports or sipped coffee like it was just another night. But it wasn't. Shaq could see it in their faces. Something had shifted. The video was out, and the world was watching. The hallway stretched long ahead, but at the very end, one door stood open, a golden nameplate glinting under the fluorescent lights. Police Chief R. Calloway. Shaq was led straight inside. Chief Calloway sat behind his massive wooden desk, his fingers pressed together, face unreadable. He was a burly man in his late 50s, his salt and pepper mustache twitching slightly as he exhaled. The blinds behind him were closed, but the faint glow of streetlights seeped through, casting long shadows across the room. Have a seat, the chief said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Shaq didn't sit. You called me, Shaq said, his voice low and firm. So, let's talk. The chief studied him for a long moment before nodding. He pushed a folder across the desk, flipping it open with 2 fingers. Inside were stacks of reports, each one stamped with Officer Darren Cole's name. We have a problem, Calloway admitted. His tone was measured, but there was something else beneath it. Reluctance. Maybe even guilt. Shaq glanced down at the paperwork, his eyes scanning the reports. Excessive force, civilian complaints, suspensions that mysteriously led to reinstatements. The list went on. Not just one problem, Shaq muttered, his fingers tapping against the desk. This guy's been doing this for years, the chief sighed, leaning back in his chair. And he's always gotten away with it. Shaq's jaw tightened. He already knew the answer, but he asked anyway. Why? Calloway let out a slow breath. Connections. Powerful friends. A system that protects its own. He rubbed his temples. And if I'm being honest, fear. Officers who speak up against Cole end up reassigned, blacklisted, or worse. He's built himself a shield, and nobody's ever had the leverage to break it. Shaq finally took a seat, folding his arms. Not this time. The chief gave a weary nod. That's why I called you in. We need your help. Shaq narrowed his eyes. We? Calloway leaned forward. This is bigger than just one bad cop. You've seen how fast this story spread. The department's getting flooded with calls. Protesters are already outside. City officials are demanding answers. This thing is spiraling, and if we don't get ahead of it, we're looking at a full-blown scandal that could take down more than just Cole. Shaq exhaled slowly, processing the weight of the moment. He wasn't just dealing with one corrupt cop. This was a whole system that had turned a blind eye. He leaned in, locking eyes with Calloway. You want a clean house? Then you start with Cole. No more suspensions, no more internal reviews. You take him off the streets permanently. Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. That's easier said than done. Shaq's voice was like steel. Then let's make it happen. Shaq leaned forward in his chair, his massive hands clasped together as he studied the police chief's face. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw tightened at the words he had just heard. We need your help. His voice was calm but laced with suspicion. What do you mean you need my help? Chief Calloway sighed, running a hand over his face as if the weight of the conversation was crushing him. He hesitated for a second before sliding another file across the desk. Shaq opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. What he saw made his stomach churn. The file wasn't just about Officer Darren Cole. It was bigger than that. There were names, city officials, department heads, even a few politicians, people who had been shielding Cole for years. Some had quietly dismissed complaints against him. Others had made sure he kept his job despite countless red flags. Shaq shook his head in disgust. So that's why he thinks he can get away with anything. Calloway nodded grimly. Cole isn't just some rogue cop. He's protected Eastwood style. Anytime he screws up, someone up the chain wipes it clean. He knows it. He's arrogant because he's never had to face real consequences. Shaq's fingers drummed against the desk, his mind already working ahead. He knew corruption ran deep, but seeing it laid out in black and white made it hit differently. You're telling me you've known this for years? He asked, his voice dangerously low. Calloway exhaled through his nose. I knew something was off, but I never had enough to go after him. Every time we got close, the evidence disappeared. Witnesses changed their stories. Officers who spoke out were suddenly transferred. It's a web, Shaq, one that's been built carefully over time. Shaq shut the folder and slid it back across the desk. Then, without a word, he pulled out his phone. The chief raised an eyebrow. What are you doing? Shaq didn't answer. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts, found the number he needed, and hit dial. The phone rang twice before a voice picked up. This is Lisa Martinez, Channel 7 News. Shaq didn't waste time with pleasantries. Lisa, it's Shaq. I've got a story for you. A pause, then. I'm listening. He glanced up at the chief, who was staring at him with a mix of caution and curiosity. Ever heard of an officer named Darren Cole? Another pause, shorter this time. Yeah, why? Shaq smirked. Because by tomorrow, the whole world's gonna know his name. The chief exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. This is about to get messy. Shaq slid his phone back into his pocket, his expression hard as steel. Good. The sun had barely risen when the city woke up to chaos. Headlines flashed across every major news station, social media feeds exploded, and videos of the incident outside the grocery store had already racked up millions of views. Racist cop arrests innocent kid. Big Shaq gets involved. Shaq sat in his truck, scrolling through the flood of reactions. Every major news outlet had picked up the story. Clips of Officer Darren Cole aggressively cuffing Malik, the frightened 10-year-old, played on a loop. The footage of Shaq stepping in, standing his ground, and refusing to let the injustice slide was everywhere. The world was watching now. Outside the police station, a storm was brewing. A crowd had gathered, and it was growing by the minute. Protesters held signs reading, "Justice for Malik," and "Stop Police Corruption." Angry voices chanted in unison, demanding accountability. Reporters swarmed the entrance, shoving microphones at anyone who would speak. Inside, the atmosphere was even tenser. Officer Cole sat in a chair, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. His badge and gun had already been taken, and his name was now at the center of a full-blown investigation. He sneered at the television mounted in the corner of the room, where the mayor was giving a live press conference. "We take this matter very seriously," Mayor Johnson announced, his voice firm but calculated. "There will be a full review of Officer Cole's actions. Effective immediately, he has been placed on unpaid suspension, pending further investigation." Cole scoffed. Suspension? That was just a slap on the wrist. He wasn't worried. Not yet. Back at the station, Shaq leaned against the hood of his truck, watching the scene unfold. He had seen this playbook before. A public statement, an investigation, and then after the noise died down, business as usual. He wasn't about to let that happen. A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You did good, Shaq," Lisa Martinez from Channel 7 said, stepping beside him. "But you and I both know this isn't over." Shaq let out a slow exhale, his gaze locked on the police station's doors. Not even close. Across the street, a black car sat idling, windows tinted too dark to see inside. A phone rang. A voice answered. "We have a problem." Officer Darren Cole had spent his entire career walking the line between law enforcement and unchecked power. But today, that line had been erased. With cameras flashing outside, Cole stormed into the precinct, his face twisted with rage. His once pristine uniform was wrinkled, his belt lighter without his badge or firearm. He shoved open the door to the captain's office, not bothering to knock. "This is a goddamn witch hunt," he spat, slamming his fists onto the desk. "I want my badge back." Captain Reynolds, a grizzled veteran with years of experience dealing with hot-headed officers, barely looked up from the paperwork in front of him. "Cole, you're lucky you're not in a holding cell right now. Get out of my office." Cole's nostrils flared. "I have rights. That punk kid was resisting, and that oversized wannabe hero, Shaq or whatever, he got in my way. I should be suing him." At that moment, the door creaked open again. A calm but authoritative voice cut through the tension. "Funny you should mention that." Cole turned, his blood boiling as Shaq stepped inside. He towered over both men, his presence alone commanding the room. The faintest smirk played on his lips as he folded his arms across his chest. "See, I heard you were thinking about filing a lawsuit," Shaq continued, "so I figured I'd stop by and save you the embarrassment." Cole sneered. "Interference. That's what you did. You assaulted an officer." Shaq let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. "If I had assaulted you, you wouldn't be standing here crying about it." The room fell silent. Even Captain Reynolds fought the urge to smirk. Cole's face burned red, but he wasn't done yet. If he was going down, he was taking others with him. "You want to play this game?" he growled. "Fine. I'll file an official complaint. I'll sue the department. I'll sue the city." A knock at the door cut him off. A uniformed officer stepped inside, holding a thick file. "Sir, we have a situation," the officer said, handing it to the captain. Reynolds opened the folder and skimmed through its contents. His expression darkened. He let out a long sigh before looking up. "Well, Cole, looks like you're about to be real busy in court." Cole frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" The captain held up the folder. "Malik's family just filed a lawsuit against the department. And guess what? They're gonna win." Cole staggered back as if he'd been punched. His career, his reputation, everything was slipping through his fingers. "And one more thing," Reynolds said, leaning forward. "The judge just threw out your case against Shaq. Something about it being ridiculous and a desperate grasp at straws." Cole's face twisted in fury, but there was nothing left to fight for. A final nail was driven into the coffin. The officer standing by the door cleared his throat. "Sir, turn in your uniform. Your badge has been permanently revoked." Shaq could have walked away. The battle was won. Cole was finished, stripped of his badge, his name smeared across headlines for all the wrong reasons. But Shaq wasn't the type to celebrate one victory and call it a day. He knew this was bigger than just one corrupt cop. It wasn't just about Darren Cole. It was about the system that allowed men like him to thrive. The mayor's office was buzzing when Shaq arrived. Reporters swarmed the steps, news crews set up outside, eager for a statement. Mayor Richardson, a shrewd man in his late 50s, ran a hand down his face as he studied the documents in front of him. Across from him, Shaq sat with his arms crossed, waiting. "You're putting me in a tough spot here," the mayor finally admitted. Shaq leaned forward. "You think it's tough for you? Try explaining to a 10-year-old why he got arrested for standing outside a grocery store." The mayor sighed. He couldn't argue with that. He glanced at his advisors, who shifted uncomfortably. "What exactly do you want, Shaq?" Shaq didn't hesitate. Change, real change. For years, the city had turned a blind eye to officers like Cole, men who hid behind their badges, who used authority as a weapon rather than a shield. Shaq laid it all out. He wanted policies that actually meant something. Mandatory body cams with real consequences for tampering. Independent reviews for use of force complaints. Stricter vetting for new recruits. And most importantly, an end to racial profiling. The mayor listened, his expression unreadable. But then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's make it happen." By the next morning, the city was buzzing again, but this time, for the right reasons. The mayor's office issued an emergency press release announcing immediate police reform measures. Internal investigations were being reopened. Officers with multiple misconduct complaints were being placed under review. And Darren Cole? Banned, permanently. The news spread fast. Talk shows debated the impact. Social media erupted, demanding other cities follow suit. It wasn't just a local story anymore. It was a movement. And Shaq? He wasn't done yet. The press conference was held in front of City Hall, cameras flashing as he stepped up to the podium. A crowd of protesters and supporters alike stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting. He adjusted the mic, took a deep breath, and spoke the words that would make history. "This ain't just about one bad cop," Shaq said, his voice steady. "This is about changing the whole system." The crowd roared, the moment electric. But in the shadows, not everyone was celebrating. Somewhere in the city, powerful men were watching, realizing that Shaq wasn't just a problem, he was a threat, and they weren't going down without a fight. Darren Cole sat hunched over on a stained motel bed, the dim light of a flickering lamp casting jagged shadows on the peeling wallpaper. His career was gone. His name, once spoken with authority, was now a nationwide disgrace. The television hummed in the background, but it was the words on the screen that felt like a blade twisting in his gut. Shaq's actions changed the city forever. Cole's grip tightened around the cheap plastic remote, his knuckles turning white. The news anchor continued, voice unwavering. In a historic move, city officials have approved sweeping police reforms following the viral video of Officer Darren Cole's wrongful arrest of a 10-year-old boy. The policy changes, pushed forward with the help of former basketball star and activist Shaquille Big Shaq Jackson, are being called a turning point for law enforcement accountability. Cole let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. His phone vibrated beside him, but he didn't bother checking. He already knew who it was. Old colleagues distancing themselves, former friends cutting ties. He reached for the bottle of cheap whiskey on the nightstand. But even as he took a swig, the burn in his throat couldn't drown out the truth. He had lost. And worse, the whole damn world was watching. Meanwhile, across town, Shaq stood outside City Hall, shaking hands with Malik's family. The boy gripped Shaq's massive hand with both of his own, eyes wide with admiration. "Thank you, sir," Malik said softly, his voice still carrying the weight of what had happened. Shaq crouched down to his level, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now, little man," he said. "Ain't nobody gonna mess with you again." Malik's mother wiped away a tear, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my son," she whispered. "You saved a lot of people today." Nearby, the police chief, an older man who had seen too many years of corruption, extended a firm handshake to Shaq. "We needed this," he admitted. "The whole city did." Shaq nodded. "Then make sure it sticks." As he turned to leave, the sea of reporters that had been waiting finally got their moment. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved forward, and a young journalist managed to push her way to the front. "Mr. Shaq," she called out, "why did you get involved in all of this?" Shaq paused. He could have said 100 things about injustice, about power, about standing up when nobody else would, but instead he just smirked. Because somebody had to. The crowd erupted in applause. And somewhere, behind thousands of screens, millions of viewers watched the moment unfold. The video of Cole's downfall skyrocketed past 20 million views. Justice had been served, but this was just the beginning.